The billionaire's son had been deaf since birth, until the maid pulled out something that shocked them all. Welcome to True Soul Narratives, where every story carries a heartbeat, love, betrayal, kindness, and the courage to start again. Before we start, comment below and let us know where you are watching from. Enjoy the story. The penthouse was silent except for the soft gasp that escaped Veronica Whitmore's lips. Every eye in the room locked onto Jasmine Brooks as her trembling hands slowly reached into the pocket of her uniform. The young maid's fingers clutched something small, something that had been hidden for decades. Preston stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with each anxious breath. The police officer's hand hovered near his belt. Veronica's face drained of all color, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask about to crack. What Jasmine held in her trembling hands would shatter everything this billionaire family thought they knew. It would expose a lie so devastating, so calculated, that it had stolen 25 years from a man who deserved so much more. But to understand why this moment mattered, why this young woman was willing to risk everything, we need to go back 3 months. Preston Whitmore was the kind of man people noticed. 28 years old, devastatingly handsome with sharp features that belonged on magazine covers. He moved through the world like a ghost in his own life. His penthouse stretched across the top floor of a Manhattan high-rise, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of a city he could never fully hear. Every luxury money could buy surrounded him. Marble floors, designer furniture, art worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But none of it filled the silence. None of it made him feel less alone. Preston had been deaf since birth, or at least that's what everyone believed. That's what his mother Veronica told the world, told the society pages, told anyone who asked about her son's condition, with that perfectly practiced expression of brave maternal suffering. She wore his deafness like a designer accessory, a tragedy that made her seem noble for simply existing as his mother. The truth was uglier. Veronica saw her son's deafness as a burden, an inconvenience that required too much effort. While Preston had learned to read lips with near-perfect accuracy, while he communicated in fluid, beautiful sign language, his own family had never bothered to learn a single sign. Not one. They spoke about him as if he weren't in the room, made decisions for him without including him, treated him like an expensive piece of furniture that required special care, but didn't have thoughts, feelings, or opinions that mattered. Behind his composed exterior, behind the tailored suits and the distant politeness, Preston was drowning in loneliness. He attended business meetings where people spoke at him through interpreters. He sat through family dinners where conversations flowed around him like water around a stone. He existed in a gilded cage surrounded by people who saw his disability before they saw him. That's when Jasmine Brooks arrived. She came on a Tuesday morning in early March, her references impeccable, her demeanor quiet and professional. At 24, Jasmine carried herself with a dignity that seemed earned, not inherited. She was a young black woman with observant eyes that took in everything, processed it, and filed it away. Before this job, she'd been working 3 positions, running herself ragged between a diner, a dry cleaner, and weekend shifts at a grocery store. Every dollar she scraped together went into an envelope addressed to her grandmother in Georgia, a woman whose medical bills were slowly consuming everything Jasmine had. When the Whitmore position opened, live-in housekeeper for one of Manhattan's wealthiest families, Jasmine knew it was her chance to finally breathe. One job, good pay, a room of her own. She could help her grandmother and maybe, just maybe, have something left for herself. Her first day, Jasmine noticed everything. The way Veronica Whitmore spoke about Preston as if he were a child, not a grown man. The casual cruelty of discussing his schedule, his meals, his entire life in front of him without ever addressing him directly. The way Preston's shoulders tensed when his mother entered a room, how his jaw tightened when she patted his arm with that condescending smile. Something sparked in Jasmine that first day. A familiar anger, a recognition of injustice she'd seen before. This wasn't right. This man, this brilliant, isolated man, deserved better. It happened on her 3rd day. Preston was walking through the living room, distracted by something on his phone, when it slipped from his hand. The device hit the marble floor with a crack that Jasmine heard, but Preston didn't. He stopped, looking down at the shattered screen with resignation, as if this was just another thing in his life that broke without warning. Jasmine moved quickly, crossing the room and bending to pick up the phone. Their eyes met as she straightened, holding the device out to him. Most people looked at Preston with pity, or worse, that careful blankness that meant they were uncomfortable in trying to hide it. Jasmine just looked at him, saw him, not his deafness, him. Then her hands moved, slow, deliberate, clear. She signed, "Thank you for having me in your home." Preston froze. His breath caught. His eyes went wide. No one in this house had ever signed to him. Not once, not in 28 years. He stared at this young woman, this housekeeper he'd barely noticed before, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Where did you learn that?" He spoke aloud, his voice carrying that particular quality of someone who'd never heard their own words. Jasmine read his lips easily, her expression softening. "My little brother was deaf," she said, signing as she spoke. "I promised him I'd never let anyone feel unheard." The word was hung in the air between them. Past tense. Preston understood loss. He saw it in the brief shadow that crossed her face, the way her hands stilled for just a moment. He understood that Jasmine had loved someone deeply, had lost them, and had turned that grief into a promise. A promise she was keeping even now for a stranger, in a billionaire's penthouse where kindness seemed to be the only thing money couldn't buy. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Preston felt seen, not as a disability, not as a burden, not as Veronica Whitmore's tragic son, just as a person who deserved to be spoken to, not about. If you're enjoying this story and want more narratives that touch the heart, don't even forget to subscribe to True Soul Narratives. We bring you stories that remind you what it means to be human. Something had shifted in that moment. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple exchange, those few signs in a silent room, had set something in motion that would change everything. The weeks that followed changed everything. Every morning, Jasmine would pass Preston in the hallway, and her hands would move in that familiar, beautiful way. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" Simple questions, everyday words that most people took for granted. But for Preston, they were everything. Someone was finally talking to him, not at him, not around him, to him. His cold exterior, that wall he'd built to protect himself from a world that couldn't be bothered to include him, began to crack. Piece by piece, sign by sign, Jasmine was dismantling years of isolation with nothing but her presence and her willingness to see him. She started leaving him notes, little illustrations of sign language with jokes written underneath. A drawing of hands signing coffee with the caption, "The most important word in any language." Another showed the sign for Monday with a dramatic, sad face. Preston found himself smiling at these small gestures, collecting them like treasures. He'd never had someone go out of their way to make him laugh, to include him in the casual humor that everyone else shared so easily. He started timing his schedule around her. If Jasmine cleaned the library in the afternoon, suddenly Preston needed to read in the library. If she organized the study in the morning, he discovered urgent work that required his attention at exactly that time. He told himself he was just being friendly, just appreciating someone who treated him with basic human decency. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He was seeking her out because she made him feel less alone. Veronica noticed. Of course she noticed. Nothing happened in her home without her knowledge, without her control. She cornered Preston one evening, her voice sharp with disapproval. "She staffed, Preston. Don't be inappropriate." The words hit him like a slap. His mother didn't sign them, didn't bother to include him in the conversation properly. She simply spoke them, knowing he'd read her lips, knowing he'd understand the warning. The implication was clear. Jasmine wasn't his equal. She was beneath him. And any connection between them was something shameful, something that needed to be stopped. Preston said nothing, but his jaw tightened. His mother had just confirmed what he'd always known. In her world, in her carefully constructed hierarchy, he was a trophy to be displayed and a burden to be managed. And anyone who treated him differently was a threat. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Preston gave up on sleep. His mind wouldn't quiet, thoughts spinning in the darkness of his room. He pulled on a shirt and wandered toward the kitchen, not expecting to find anyone awake. But there she was. Jasmine sat at the small table in the corner, the one the staff used, her phone clutched in both hands. Her shoulders shook. Tears ran down her face, silent and devastating. She didn't hear him approach, lost in whatever message glowed on her screen. Preston hesitated, then stepped into her line of sight. Jasmine looked up, startled, immediately wiping at her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I should go." Her hands moved frantically as she spoke, apology and embarrassment warring in her expression. Preston's hands moved before he could think. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, trying to compose herself, but he saw the phone screen. Medical bills, rows and rows of numbers, amounts that would crush anyone, amounts that made his chest tight with recognition. "How much do you need?" he signed and spoke simultaneously. Jasmine's eyes went wide. No, I'm not asking you for money. I don't want your pity." Her voice was fierce despite the tears, pride burning through the vulnerability. Preston stepped closer, his expression intense. "It's not pity. You're the only person who sees me as human. Let me help." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Jasmine stared at him, her pride warring with desperation. He could see it in her eyes, the way she wanted to accept, needed to accept, but couldn't bear to be seen as someone who took advantage. She shook her head again, standing up. "I can't. I won't. Thank you, but no." She left the kitchen quickly, leaving Preston alone with the weight of what he'd learned. Jasmine was suffering, struggling under a burden that would break most people, and she still showed up every day with kindness and dignity. She still took the time to sign to him, to leave him notes, to treat him like he mattered. If anything, it made him respect her more. 2 weeks later, Preston's birthday arrived with all the ceremony and spectacle that Veronica Whitmore demanded. The penthouse was transformed into a glittering showcase, hundreds of New York's elite packed into the space. They called it a celebration. Preston called it a performance. He sat in a corner, watching people toast to his health, his success, his future. None of them signed. None of them tried to include him in the conversation swirling around him. They celebrated at him, not with him. His mother held court in the center of the room, Preston's deafness woven into her stories like she was the hero for simply raising him. "Look how well he's done despite everything. Look how devoted I am." She paraded him like a trophy, proof of her sacrifice and patience. Jasmine worked the event, moving through the crowd with trays, invisible to the guests in the way service workers always were. But she watched. She saw how Preston sat alone in a room full of people. She saw how Veronica touched his shoulder for photos, then immediately turned away. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his smile never reached them. Something inside her snapped. This wasn't right. This wasn't a celebration. This was cruelty dressed up in expensive champagne and designer gowns. She set down her tray, smoothed her uniform, and walked straight across the room. Every step was deliberate. She stopped in front of Preston, ignoring the curious glances from nearby guests. Her hands moved, bold and clear. "Do you want to get out of here?" Preston's eyes widened in shock. She had just broken every rule, crossed every line that separated their worlds. Staff didn't address the family directly at events. Staff certainly didn't suggest that the guest of honor abandon his own party. But Jasmine wasn't looking at him like staff. She was looking at him like someone who saw a person trapped and was offering an escape. Preston glanced at his mother across the room, then back at Jasmine. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine one of the night. He stood, took Jasmine's hand, and let her lead him away. They slipped through the crowd, out a side door, up 2 flights of stairs to the rooftop. The sounds of the party faded below them, replaced by the quiet hum of the city in the cool night air. Preston turned to face her, his breath visible in the cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Preston's hands began to sign, his voice accompanying the movements. "Everyone treats my deafness like it makes me less. Broken. A tragedy. Like I'm something to be fixed or pitied or managed." His voice cracked slightly, years of frustration pouring out. Jasmine stepped closer, her own hands moving as she spoke. You're not broken. Your mother is just too lazy to learn your language. The bluntness of it hit Preston like a shock. Then he laughed, a real, genuine, unguarded laugh. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever called out his family's failure so directly. Why do you care so much? He asked, his signs slowing, his expression open and vulnerable in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. Jasmine hesitated, her hands stilled. She looked out at the city lights, gathering her courage. Because I know what it's like to be invisible, she finally said. To be in a room full of people and feel completely alone. To work yourself to exhaustion and still not be enough. To love someone so much and not be able to save them. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. My brother. He was 8 when he died. Meningitis. We couldn't afford the treatment fast enough. I learned sign language for him, and I promised him I'd never let anyone else feel unheard. I'd never let anyone else be invisible. Preston's chest tightened. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, not quite touching. The air between them crackled with something unspoken. Jasmine's breath caught. They leaned closer, the space between them shrinking. Then reality crashed back. Boundaries. Rules. The impossible gap between their worlds. They both pulled back at the same moment. The almost kiss hanging in the air like something fragile and dangerous. Jasmine cleared her throat, stepping back. We should go back before your mother notices. But as they made their way down to the party, something had fundamentally shifted. They both knew it. They both felt it. And neither of them knew how to stop what was already in motion. The next morning shattered the fragile peace like glass hitting marble. Veronica's voice cut through the penthouse, sharp and cold with accusation. My bracelet is missing. The diamond bracelet, the one worth $50,000, was gone from her jewelry box. Within an hour, security had reviewed the footage. The camera showed Jasmine walking past Veronica's bedroom door 3 days ago, her cleaning cart beside her. It was circumstantial, barely evidence at all. But Veronica didn't need proof. She needed a target, and she'd found one. The police arrived by noon. 2 officers stood in the living room while Veronica paced, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dramatically. I want her arrested, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. These people always... Preston cut her off, his voice louder than anyone had ever heard it. Don't finish that sentence. The room went silent. Preston's hands were shaking, his face flushed with rage he could barely contain. Veronica blinked, momentarily thrown by her son's interruption, but she recovered quickly. Preston, don't be naive. The evidence is clear. Jasmine stood in the center of the room, still and dignified despite the accusations swirling around her. She didn't protest, didn't defend herself, didn't break down. She simply stood there, her chin raised, her eyes clear. It was the dignity of someone who'd been through worse, who knew that sometimes the world decided you were guilty before you ever had a chance to speak. Preston moved toward the security station, signing and speaking simultaneously. I want to review all the footage myself, every camera, every angle. Veronica stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Preston, stop. She's manipulated you. Used your condition to get close to you. Can't you see that? The word condition hit Preston like a physical blow. His mother had just reduced his entire existence to a weakness someone could exploit. As if his deafness made him incapable of judgment, of seeing people clearly, of making his own decisions. As if Jasmine's kindness, her respect, her willingness to communicate with him in his own language, was all part of some elaborate scheme to steal a bracelet. The rage that had been simmering in Preston for 28 years finally boiled over. One of the officers moved toward Jasmine, handcuffs ready. We're going to need you to come with us, ma'am. Preston stepped between them so fast the officer actually stumbled back. You're not touching her. His voice shook, but not with fear, with fury, with years of suppressed anger at a world that had dismissed him, controlled him, spoken for him without ever listening. Veronica's face flushed red. Preston, stop being foolish. She's just a maid. Those words hung in the air, ugly and raw. Just a maid. as if Jasmine's worth could be measured by her job title, as if her humanity was somehow less than theirs because she cleaned their home instead of owning it. Preston turned to face his mother fully, his signs sharp and angry. "She's the only person who's ever treated me like I matter." His voice cracked on the last word, emotion bleeding through. "The only person in this entire house who bothered to learn how to talk to me, who sees me as human instead of a burden or a tragedy or a PR opportunity." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "You're being dramatic. She stole from us." "No," Preston signed and spoke, his hands shaking. "You want her arrested because she made me realize how little you care, how little you've ever cared." The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to walk into a family confrontation. "Ma'am, we still need to—" Preston cut them off. "If she goes, I go." The room froze. "And I take the trust fund, the company shares, everything. Every asset my grandfather left me. Every connection I have in this city. You'll have nothing, Mother. Nothing but your empty penthouse and your manufactured sympathy." It was a nuclear option, and everyone knew it. Veronica's face went pale. Preston's inheritance was substantial, but more than that, his name carried weight in business circles. Without him, without his signature on documents, without his silent presence at meetings, Veronica's carefully constructed empire would crumble. She'd built her entire identity around being his devoted mother, his caretaker, his voice in a world he supposedly couldn't navigate alone. If he walked away, she was nothing. The standoff stretched, tension thick enough to choke on. Veronica's eyes darted between Preston and Jasmine, calculating, trying to find a way to regain control. Then Jasmine spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the silence. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't take your bracelet." Everyone turned to look at her, "But I know where it is." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of confusion spreading across every face. The officers paused. Preston's eyes widened. Veronica's expression flickered, just for a second, with something that looked like fear. Jasmine reached slowly into her uniform pocket. Every movement was deliberate, careful, as if she were defusing a bomb. "When I was cleaning 3 days ago, I found something." Her hand emerged, closed around something small. "I've been trying to figure out how to return it without this." She gestured at the police, the accusations, the chaos that had erupted around her. "Without it becoming exactly what it's become." "What are you talking about?" Veronica's voice was sharp, but there was an edge of panic beneath it. Jasmine's hand opened slowly. In her palm lay the diamond bracelet, glittering and unmistakable. But wrapped around it, intertwined with the expensive jewelry, was something else. Something small and outdated and completely unexpected. A child's hearing aid. The room seemed to stop breathing. Preston stared at the objects in Jasmine's hand, his face draining of color. Veronica made a small choked sound. The police officers looked confused, not understanding why a hearing aid would matter, why its presence would cause such a reaction. Jasmine's voice was steady as she continued. "I found these together, hidden in the back of your closet, Mrs. Whitmore, behind old shoeboxes and garment bags, like someone didn't want them found." She held them out, the bracelet and the hearing aid catching the light. "This hearing aid is 30 years old. The prescription label is still on it. It says Preston Whitmore." Preston reached out with shaking hands and took the device. He turned it over, examining it, his fingers tracing the worn edges. His lips moved, forming silent words no one could hear. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at his mother, confusion and something darker, something like dawning horror spreading across his face. Veronica tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The carefully composed mask she always wore had cracked completely, and beneath it was naked fear. Jasmine took a breath, her next words measured and careful. The doctor's notes were with it, tucked inside the case. "You weren't born deaf, Preston." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's hands stilled, his eyes went wide. The hearing aid trembled in his grip. "What?" Jasmine's expression was pained, like she didn't want to be the one delivering this truth, But someone had to. You lost your hearing at age 3. Meningitis. According to the medical records, it was treatable. The surgery had a high success rate, but she hesitated, glancing at Veronica. The consent forms were never signed. Preston's world tilted. Everything he'd believed about himself, about his identity, about who he was, suddenly felt like a lie. He looked at his mother, desperate for her to deny it, to explain, to make it make sense. But Veronica's silence was answer enough. The medical report was clipped to the paperwork. Jasmine continued quietly. It shows the treatment options, the history, the insurance coverage, and it shows that your mother refused the surgery. Preston's hands began to shake violently. He couldn't sign, couldn't speak. He just stared at the small device in his palm, this piece of his past that had been hidden from him for 25 years. Too expensive, Jasmine said, her voice barely a whisper. Too risky. Those were the reasons listed. But there was something else in the file. An insurance policy, disability coverage, long-term payments. Preston felt something break inside him. Not his heart, something deeper, the foundation of his entire existence. You let me believe I was born this way. His voice was hollow, distant, that it couldn't be helped, that I was just broken from the start. Veronica finally found her voice. The surgery had risks, Preston. You could have. He cut her off, his rage returning with devastating force. 25 years. You let me suffer in silence for 25 years. You let me grow up thinking I was different, damaged, less than everyone else. You never learned to sign. You never tried. And now I know why. His hands moved frantically as he spoke, signs sharp and accusatory. You didn't want a disabled son. You wanted the insurance payout. The truth hit everyone in the room like a physical force. Veronica had let her son live with a disability that could have been treated, possibly reversed, because it was financially beneficial, because it was easier than surgery, than risk, than actually caring for him in a way that required effort. Jasmine stood silent, the empty bracelet still in her hand. I wasn't going to say anything, she said quietly. It wasn't my place. I was just going to return the bracelet anonymously and let the past stay buried. But then you tried to destroy me to cover your own guilt. Her eyes met Veronica's, and there was steel in that gaze. He deserves to know the truth. He deserved it all along. Preston looked at Jasmine, and in that moment, he understood. She had risked everything for him. Her job, her reputation, her freedom. She'd stood in front of police and accusations and a billionaire's rage, all to give him the truth that had been stolen from him. Veronica had nothing left to say. The officers looked at each other, uncertain. This had stopped being about a stolen bracelet and become something much bigger, much more painful. What would you like us to do, sir? One of them asked Preston. Preston stared at his mother for a long moment. Then his hands moved, cold and final. Press charges, fraud, 25 years of insurance fraud. The charges were filed within 24 hours. Insurance fraud, financial exploitation of a disabled dependent, falsification of medical consent documents. The list went on, each line a testament to the depth of Veronica's betrayal. Preston's lawyers moved with surgical precision, and Veronica, for all her money and connections, had no defense against the truth. The evidence was irrefutable. The medical records, the insurance payouts, the hearing aid hidden like a guilty secret. She'd built 25 years of her life on a lie, and now it was crumbling around her. Preston cut her off completely, changed the locks, removed her from every account, every board, every position of power she'd held in his name. The penthouse, the one she decorated and controlled and ruled from like a throne, belonged to him. It always had. She just convinced him he needed her to manage it, to manage him, to manage his entire existence. Now she was gone, escorted out by security with 2 suitcases and a lawyer on speed dial. The society pages that had once praised her devotion now whispered about her cruelty. The same people who'd called her a saint for raising a disabled son now called her a monster for creating one. Jasmine stood in the hallway, watching the chaos unfold, her small duffel bag packed at her feet. I should go, she said quietly when Preston found her there. This is family business. I don't belong here anymore. Preston's hands moved quickly, desperately. You're more family than she ever was. His voice cracked, raw with emotion. She saw me as a burden. You see me as a person. That's the difference. That's everything. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to stay. God, she wanted to stay. But the gap between their worlds still felt impossibly wide. Stay, please. Preston signed and spoke the words with such vulnerability that Jasmine's resistance crumbled. She dropped her bag. She nodded. And for the first time since the revelation, since the world had turned upside down, Preston felt like he could breathe. The weeks that followed were a strange new normal. Preston threw himself into research, consulting with specialists about his hearing loss, about treatment options, about whether anything could be done after so many years. The prognosis was uncertain. The surgery was experimental, risky, with no guarantee of success. But for the first time in his life, Preston had a choice. Not a decision made for him, but a real choice about his own body, his own future. Jasmine was there for all of it. The consultations, the endless medical discussions, the moments when Preston broke down from the weight of what had been stolen from him. She didn't try to fix him or push him toward any decision. She just stayed, present, steady, a constant in the chaos. They talked for hours, signing and speaking, about everything and nothing, about his childhood, about her brother, about the lives they'd lived in silence and isolation, about what it meant to be seen, really seen, by another person. And somewhere in those conversations, in the quiet moments between words, something bloomed. Not the desperate attraction of the rooftop, but something more. Trust, partnership, love. 6 months after Veronica's arrest, Preston made his decision he would try the surgery. Not because he thought being deaf made him broken, he'd learned that lesson the hard way, but because he wanted the choice. He wanted to experience sound on his own terms, not as something denied to him by someone else's greed. The surgery was scheduled for a cold morning in November. Experimental procedure, cutting-edge technology, and a surgeon who specialized in restoring hearing to late deafened adults. The success rate was uncertain. The risks were real. But Jasmine held his hand in the pre-op room, her fingers laced through his. And Preston knew that whatever happened, he wouldn't face it alone. I'm scared, he signed. She squeezed his hand. I know, but you're the bravest person I've ever met. The anesthesia pulled him under, and the last thing he saw was Jasmine's face, steady and sure, promising without words that she'd be there when he woke up. The surgery took 6 hours. Jasmine paced the waiting room, her phone clutched in her hand, Preston's lawyer keeping her updated on his condition. When they finally wheeled him into recovery, still groggy and disoriented, Jasmine was allowed in. She sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall, his eyes moving beneath closed lids. Then they opened. Preston blinked slowly, consciousness returning in stages. He saw Jasmine first, her face tight with worry and hope. His hand reached for hers instinctively. She took it, holding on like a lifeline. The doctors had warned them it would take time, that even if the surgery worked, his brain would need to adjust, to learn how to process sound after decades of silence. Can you hear me? Jasmine spoke the words carefully, her lips moving clearly so he could read them, even if the surgery had failed. Preston's face was unreadable for a long moment. Then his eyes filled with tears. They spilled down his cheeks, hot and unstoppable. His hand tightened around hers. Yes. The word came out rough, choked with emotion. Yes, I can hear you. Jasmine's composure shattered. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Preston was crying too, overwhelmed by the sound of his own voice, by the rustle of sheets, by the steady beep of monitors, by Jasmine's soft gasps of joy. Everything was too loud and too much and absolutely perfect. He heard her breathing. He heard her tears. He heard the world he'd been shut out from for 25 years, and it was beautiful and terrifying and real. I love you. Preston spoke the words aloud for the first time, hearing them as he said them. The sound of his own declaration shook him to his core. 3 words he'd signed 100 times but never heard. Jasmine leaned closer, her hands moving even as she spoke. I love you too. She signed it clearly, beautifully, and Preston heard her voice wrapping around the words like a gift. Her voice was softer than he had imagined, warmer, with a slight rasp that made his heart ache. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He reached up, cupping her face with shaking hands, and pulled her into a kiss. Their first real kiss, without hesitation, without boundaries, without anything between them except love and gratitude and the miracle of second chances. When they pulled apart, Preston laughed. The sound startled him, hearing his own laughter, and that made him laugh harder. Jasmine laughed too, the sound mixing with his, and Preston closed his eyes just to listen to it. To hear joy, to hear love, to hear everything he'd been denied. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that it's never too late for truth, for justice, for love, please subscribe to True Soul Narratives. We share stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the power of standing up for what's right. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Preston still had to learn how to live in a hearing world, to process sounds, to adjust to a reality that was completely foreign. But Jasmine would be there, every step, every moment, every sound. And somewhere in a cold cell, Veronica Whitmore sat with nothing but her choices and the hollow echo of the life she'd destroyed. The insurance money was gone, seized by the courts. Her reputation was ruined. Her son wanted nothing to do with her. She'd gambled everything on control, on convenience, on her own comfort, and lost spectacularly. Preston had won something far more valuable than revenge. He'd won his voice back, his choice, his freedom. And he'd found someone who loved him, not despite his deafness, but because of who he was. All of him, every part. The maid who was supposed to be invisible had changed everything. She'd pulled out a hidden truth and shattered a decades-long lie. She'd risked her job, her freedom, her future, because she'd promised a little boy long ago that no one would ever be unheard again. And in keeping that promise, she'd found her own second chance at love, at family, at a life that wasn't just about survival, but about truly living. What do you think? Would you have had the courage to speak up like Jasmine did? Let us know in the comments below. Preston and Jasmine's story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tell the truth, even when it costs us everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, love is waiting on the other side of that truth, ready to catch us when we fall.